no sooner had Victor Hill and I recorded and uploaded last month's podcast, much of our discussion had been overtaken by more bullets of shock and awe coming from the Oval Office in the United States. Now, this month's podcast, no doubt, will discuss just what Trump has been up to since he passed his 100-day in the office milestone. But the world is so much more than the US. I'm delighted to be joined again by financial economist and fellow podcaster and friend Victor Hill. So, Victor,
good morning, Sarah. Good to see you.
Hello, thank you very much. I was just saying so much has happened since our last session.
Indeed.
Geopolitics unfolding in real time. So tell me, what is funeral diplomacy?
Well, yes, I mean, since we last convened on 9th of April, the news flow has turned into a cascade. It's difficult to keep up with everything. The world seems to be speeding up, to use the cliche. But yes, that was the very day that Trump did the reverse ferret on tariffs and basically rejigged all of those announcements that we discussed about Liberation Day on 2nd of April. But funeral diplomacy, I was thinking about the funeral of Pope Francis on the 26th of April. And, you know, there's something about funerals, isn't there, Sarah? I don't know if you agree with this, that families get together and they try to let bygones be bygones. And sometimes, you know, things happen and you know, people forgive one another to some degree. There was a fascinating scene of Trump and Starmer and Macron together with Zelensky. And then there was that extraordinary moment when two cardinals carried over stackable chairs to an alcove in the Sistine Chapel. And Trump and Zelensky had a one-to-one. And you felt that, you know, you were watching geopolitics, world history in real time. It's been a fascinating month. Don't let them say that, you know, religion doesn't matter, because clearly it does.
So aside from Zelensky and Trump, who took centre stage in the newspapers the next day, we also saw Starmer and Macron in the sideline. So would you say that the world is now focused on four main contenders and China and Russia have been neglected and forgotten about?
Well, what I would say, I mean, I'm not the greatest fan of the UK Labour government, as you may already know. That said, Starmer seems to have established himself on the world stage as a fairly savvy player, and he seems to be widely respected, and he's formed a really good alliance with Emmanuel Macron and now with Friedrich Merz in Germany. And so there's reason to suppose that, you know, there will be progress in terms of relations with the European Union. I mean, even Mr. Lamy, who I thought would be a complete embarrassment based on his past performance, even he has emerged as a reasonably diplomatic and competent foreign secretary. You know, so let's give credit where it's due, even if, you know, one isn't their greatest fan. The UK is a player on the world stage.
But Starmer, I'm just thinking about the recent sort of local elections. You know, the Labour government seems to be unpopular. The Tories are falling back. Reform UK is rampant. And Starmer does not want to live in a country of strangers. Lots of messages, mixed messages coming out of the government there.
Well, isn't it funny how the rhetoric changes? I mean, the Labour government is evidently very unpopular. And, you know, the first thing they did was to take away the pensioners' winter fuel payment. And you know what they say, that, you know, when you give a dog a bone, it reacts very generously towards you. It's very gratified. But if you take that bone away, it turns nasty. And that's what's happening in the UK. I mean, there is a lot of resentment against some of the fiscal measures that the Labour government has taken. The Labour government is back to about 20% support in the opinion polls. And as we saw in the English local elections on 1st of May, the runaway leaders in the polls, who got 30%, are Mr. Farage's Reform UK party. Now, let's just make the proviso that that election was for 23 English county councils, and therefore wasn't really taking the pulse of the nation as a whole, but it's a good indicator of where things are going. And the poor old Tories came out with about 15%. They lost 670-something local council seats, whereas Reform gained 670. something council seats. So the Tories have a real battle, not just with the left, but with the right. And how will they formulate a policy to deal with that is unclear at the moment. Yeah, I mean, the economy, it's the economy, stupid to some degree. There has not been the spurt in growth that Labour had promised. And on the contrary, when the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee cut rates last Thursday by 25 basis points, they also cut the growth forecast for next year from 1.5 to 1.25. So the fiscal situation is still grave and possibly deteriorating. Mind you, you could say that about a number of European nations and indeed the USA as well.
Let's stick with some of those international players we referenced earlier, Mr. Macron, and in terms of France, there doesn't appear to be any real progress on the deficit there, and Le Pen's been cancelled by the court. So what's happening just over the North Sea?
Yes, you see, Sarah, this rather sort of ungainly trend has emerged in Europe, that when you find your political opponents unpalatable, you basically ban them. And Marine Le Pen was accused and found guilty of various offences in terms of siphoning off expenses from the European Parliament into her political party. But that's not unusual in the European Parliament. And if even Nigel Farage, who spent over 20 years there, will tell you that this kind of behind the taking money out of the plate, as it were, is relatively common. So she's been effectively banned as a political candidate, which means that she won't be running in the French presidential election of 2027 unless she wins on appeal next year. Now, that will cause a great deal of dismay in France, not just on the right and the supporters of the RN, the Rassemblement National. And we can be sure that there will be political repercussions. Now, meanwhile, in Germany, something very similar has happened insofar as the Alternative für Deutschland, AfD, has been labelled an extremist movement. Well, okay, I mean, some of their opinions are unpalatable, but the fact is that 20% or more of the German electorate supported them on 23rd of February. And it's difficult to understand how you run a democracy by just sort of eliminating the opposition by judicial means. So this is concerning.
Mind you, I'm going to get banned if I keep getting my North Seas mixed up with my English channels. But let's go over the Atlantic. She said, fingers crossed. We have to talk about the USA. Trump's polling numbers falling, negative growth in Q1, high risk that the US might go into recession. But of course, it's not Trump's fault.
Business confidence is absolutely, plummeting in the USA. And part of that must be Trump's responsibility, because it's very difficult to take a strategic view of how you expand your business and make investment decisions when you simply do not know what the outlook is in terms of tariffs. Now, the argument that the MAGA people made was that if you put up tariffs, you force multinational corporations to reshore their production to the USA. And as we've discussed previously, there is some evidence that that is going to happen. But on the other hand, with all these tariffs constantly yo-yoing and changing, and we now have a trade deal with China as well as with the UK, which will actually cut tariffs back to something more normal, something like 30% or less. It's very difficult to know whether the Apples of this world will actually bring their production back to the USA. And indeed, Apple has now signaled its intention to open a factory in India. So that doesn't exactly fulfill Trump's aspiration to bring business back to the USA. It just means that they diversify their risks. So, yes, a huge amount of uncertainty and a lot of reports coming through from the money men, the Goldman Sachs and others, that a recession in the third quarter of this year is very likely. they do tend to err on the side of caution. That has had reverberations in terms of the financial markets, particularly the equity markets. Yeah, I mean, if the if you want to be honest, Trump's economic policy looks chaotic, and there is nothing inside his package yet which does anything to alleviate the deteriorating fiscal deficit in the USA, and that is the main concern, because going forward, the deficit is getting bigger, and America's stock of national debt is still rising, and it's got to be paid for. Now, you may have noticed that bond yields have been rising, particularly after Trump's Liz Truss moment in the run up to 9th of April, when bond yields, U.S. Treasury bond yields, went up by over 50 basis points in a week or more. So that means that America has to pay more money just to service its enormous debt, much of which is held by foreigners who are showing signs of unloading their dollar debt, which means that if they sell, bond prices will tend to fall, and that means that yields will rise further. So America has a debt problem, which, as far as I can see as yet, Trump is not addressing.
What do you think of that big deal that was announced between the US and the UK? Because many people said that the UK wasn't bargaining from a position of strength, that we should in fact have had an alliance with Europe and then tried to deal with the US. So what do you think of the deal, or was that made on the hoof as well and actually means nothing than the paper it's been written on?
Well, I think it's significant, but you see, the politicians were under pressure to get something done in a brief time, and that doesn't necessarily result in the best deal possible. Now, there are two things to note. One is that the deal, for the first time, provides quotas for the import of US agricultural products, and in particular beef and poultry. And these will probably hit the shelves in the next year or so. And if it is the case, as we suspect, that these goods will be cheaper than their British counterparts, there will be a strong negative reaction in our farming community, and indeed to some extent there already has been. Now, the issue is that the USA maintains much more lenient standards of animal welfare than we do. And for my own part, I'm sure you're inclined to do the same. You always look at the label. You want to know where the animals come from and how they've been reared. And there is the argument that so long as the product is well labelled, people can make their own choice. But it does seem unfair that British farmers will be penalised for having higher standards, and there will be repercussions. The other point is that in the short term, the deal was very good news for the UK auto industry, even though there was a quota of 100,000 vehicles a year imposed, which is about the level of our current exports to the USA. And in turn is good news for the British steel industry, which, as you know, has been struggling and basically has been partially nationalised. So short-term gain, but maybe a long-term price to pay. The devil is in the detail. We don't honestly know how this is going to play out. It will be interesting. But to the extent that the UK diverges from European regulations and standards, that will make it more difficult to negotiate a long-term trade deal with the European Union. Now, let's remember that the withdrawal agreement, the deal that Boris Johnson got over the line, for all its faults, was a zero tariff deal. There are no tariffs on goods which pass between the UK and Europe, and vice versa. So that is all to the good. The issue is that the Europeans impose all kinds of regulations and inspections which cause so-called frictions at the border, and these are what are holding up increases in trade between the EU and the UK. And the hope was that these frictions can be eliminated. For example, if the EU is prepared to recognise British veterinary standards, so that's this kind of thing. We'll see. I'm slightly sceptical, but the alliance that we've formed with Europe in so far as Russia-Ukraine is concerned means that the Europeans are more prepared to treat fairly with the British than they were previously. So I'm not a great optimist, but I think we have to be realistic, and I think there will be some good news.
Now, one of our standard bearers for higher animal welfare is our king, of course, and I'm just wondering how political a figure he is becoming, particularly as he's going to be opening the new Canadian Parliament, which is going to be hugely symbolic.
I think so. I think that's amazing news. What happened in Canada, where they had a general election on 28th of April, and indeed in Australia on 2nd of May, just was politically extraordinary, because back at the beginning of the year, in January, the Liberals in Canada were 20% behind in the polls, and the Conservatives under Poilievre looked a dead cert. Well, Poilievre lost his seat, poor man, and Mark Carney romped home. And the main reason for that is that he campaigned on the issue of Canada being independent of the USA, and that he could cook a snoop to Mr. Trump, who wants to make Canada the 51st state. Now, having been returned to power, and albeit with a minority government, to invite King Charles III to open the Parliament is a symbol to the United States that, Canada, along with the rest of the Anglosphere, is a separate entity from the USA. And, I believe that King Charles will play his role. Of course, he's very constrained in what he can say. I'm a bit concerned that, he will have to host Mr. Trump in September, which will be could potentially be quite uncomfortable. I said in one of my pieces that the respected head of the family has become the drunken uncle whose visits are dreaded by his relatives. Well, that's a little bit unkind, but I think the king does have a role to play, and I think that ditto in Australia too.
So you talk about separate entities there, ideally stock exchanges are autonomous and they are separate entities, but they do tend to copy each other. I'm thinking about the global stock market rout last month, especially after Liberation Day. I've never seen behaviour like that in almost 40 years of working in the markets. It was extraordinary. I just sat back and watched it and had lots of cups of tea.
Well, I'm glad it was tea. Extraordinary volatility, which has subsided somewhat now. And to a very high degree, the markets have clawed back their losses in mid-April. And indeed, in Europe, the bourses are doing quite nicely. And on 8th of May, which is VE Day, 2 days after the inauguration of the new German government, the German DAX hit an all-time high. So the perspective from Germany and others in Europe is that things can only get better. But my goodness, what turbulence the markets have been through, and largely induced by political decisions, as we know. But you see, governments can shrug off reverses in stock markets, and they can just say, well, that happens because of sentiment and so forth. The markets go up and markets go down. But governments cannot shrug off major shifts in bond market sentiment, because they are reliant on the bond market to keep going, to keep borrowing, and particularly if you're states with large amounts of debt like the USA and indeed the UK as well. So, the bond markets actually gave Trump a black eye in mid-April. Of course, Mr. Trump is not one to be perturbed. In fact, I think his motto is, never explain and never apologize, something like that. Never complain. Just keep going. So yeah, the bond markets actually will continue to be a source of discipline on U.S. Financial and fiscal managers. Can I just say that Trump's intervention into monetary policy is just very difficult to justify, if I can put it like that. I mean, he went through a series of announcements on his social media platform in April to the effect that Jerome Powell, who is the chairman of the Federal Reserve, the central bank, was incompetent. In fact, I think he called him a loser. Well, actually, he's had a rather distinguished career. Anyway, in Trump terms, anyone who doesn't agree with you is a loser. And there were rumors that he was going to try to unseat him, although whether that is actually constitutionally possible is disputed. But it's crazy because it would just cause huge consternation in the money markets. And I've been very critical of central bankers over many years because I think that they suffer from groupthink and they refer too much to one another, and they often don't get out of their central banking bubble. And the monetary policy is determined by a self-appointed elite. I call them the priestly caste, whereas fiscal policy at least is determined by elected politicians who can be booted out by the electorate. So I can see why Trump is frustrated. The Federal Reserve is refusing to cut interest rates, but with good reason, because inflation is still persistent in the United States. Now, even if Trump were able to get rid of Jerome Powell sits on a monetary policy committee of, I think, 7 people. And, one vote wouldn't swing it one way or the other. He would have to get rid of the entire monetary policy committee, to change policy. So this is where, we have to be a little bit, objective about some of the mutterings coming out of the White House.
So groupthink and soothing government platitudes aside, asset managers still have to make money for the pensioners, money for us, and they're now reallocating to alternative assets. They're going are equities, but more money is being put into gold and cryptocurrencies. Is this the new standard for asset management?
Well, there are a lot of people who think that equity markets, particularly Wall Street, are overvalued on valuation terms. But admittedly, Wall Street has many growth stocks which have, potentially, bright futures. The FTSE is slightly different because it's mostly composed of mature companies which pay dividends and have much lower earnings volatility. Fund managers have shown a degree of caution with regard to stocks. They're over allocated in the UK to government bonds, which have produced, in the last 20 years, really quite modest returns. But they're now looking at alternative asset classes to make money. And the two that stand out are crypto and gold. So at the end of April, the gold price hit a record high of $3,500 an ounce. Extraordinary. It's up from about $2,500 at the beginning of last year. So there's a massive increase. Gold is a classic hedge insofar as gold is what you want when things go awry, because gold has a kind of a universal value, no matter what's going on in the economy. Crypto is obviously a much newer animal, and asset managers have proven quite slow to get enthusiastic about it. But the fact is that crypto has, despite its volatility, it showed signs of soaring. And I think when I last looked, it was about $104,000 per coin. So, crypto is good news for those computer hackers, isn't it? Because that's how they get paid. Their ransoms are all paid in cryptocurrency. But maybe it could be an asset that pension funds invest in as well. I'm sure it's not going to
And
go away.
I'm sure it isn't, and I received my email from Marks and Spencers last night. I do feel for them. However,
Me too.
their recent their recent regulatory news statement was reasoned, so we didn't see the share price fall any further. But you were saying that gold achieving a record high, then another record high. But why has oil been falling?
So I think there are two things going on. One is that there is some expectation that the Russia-Ukraine war will end. We don't quite know how soon. I thought it was going to end originally by the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, which the Russians celebrated last Friday on the 9th of May. When and if that happens, there will be fewer restrictions on Russian exports of oil, and the overall supply will increase. Although it's not clear that Saudi Arabia, would they might well actually reduce production. The other reason is that all these rumors of prospective recession mean that the futures price of oil 3 and 6 months ahead is falling, because if you have a recession, demand for oil reduces, less oil is consumed. So I think that's what's going on there. But it's the lower the oil price goes, of course, that's very bad news for the Russians, who are entirely dependent on the oil price to finance this war against Ukraine. So I think we could see a further fall in the price of oil, which is good news for motorists. But I suspect it may have got to a low for now.
So this is quite time sensitive. You've mentioned Putin there and the Ukraine invasion. Do you think that the proposed Putin-Zelensky talks will go ahead?
Well, it would be amazing if they do. And in fact, it could even take place tomorrow, Thursday, the 15th of June. Now, it has even been rumored that if it happens, Trump will take Air Force One from the Middle East, where he is currently, to Istanbul. And something could happen. But I don't think, we'll probably look back in a month's time and say, well, I got this wrong. But I don't think Putin will turn up. I think his game is to string Trump and Europe along as long as he can, and hope that this will be a war of attrition by means of which Ukraine is reduced to exhaustion and finally has to concede. This whole negotiation has been very strange. I think I said last time, Trump is playing poker, Putin is playing chess. And, in Russia, which, I'm happy to have visited many times, chess is a spectator sport. You have people huddled around tables in Gorky Park as, two local guys hammer it out on the chessboard. So Trump initially started the game by giving away a few pawns in the expectation that that would mollify Putin. It didn't. Putin has just stuck to his guns. And I don't think that the Russians are in a mood to give any concessions. Difficult to judge the mood inside Russia because we only get the official picture. I suspect a lot of people, ordinary Russians, and I haven't spoken to many of my Russian friends for 3 years now, but I suspect that many of them would actually be happy to see a deal. So, I think probably the Ukrainians will have to concede Crimea and much, if not all, of the territory that Russia currently occupies. They probably won't be able to join NATO as such, but they will want some kind of security guarantee. Now, the US-Ukraine minerals deal, which was signed way back at the beginning of May, further to that famous meeting between Trump and Zelensky in the Vatican, I don't think that's very significant, and for the following reasons. First of all, a lot of those minerals are actually theoretical. No one's actually done the prospecting to determine that they are actually there, although the geology suggests they could be there. Secondly, a lot of those minerals reside in territory occupied by the Russian army, And thirdly, even if the Americans were to go in and start mining with their security details, that would not deter Russia if Ukraine ends up to be a neutered state with an insufficient military. So I think that was more for show. It kind of was window dressing. It could go either way tomorrow, and I'm not expecting a firm outcome. I think Putin will play us all along a bit longer. But I will say this, that I do know people who are looking at life in Ukraine after the peace is achieved. And I know one fund manager who actually held a dinner in Kiev a few weeks ago on the theme of investment possibilities in Ukraine post-war. I was actually invited, but it was at ridiculously short notice, so I couldn't go. But there are people talking about the opportunities after the war, so we are in the end game.
So, right, and you mentioned tomorrow, and just to be clear for our audience, when we say tomorrow, it's May the 15th, not June the 15th, as we inadvertently alluded to earlier. We are running out of time, though, unfortunately, Victor. I'm just wondering, yes. Is Trump in a bad mood with Netanyahu, because their friendship doesn't seem to be unconditional anymore, if it ever was?
No, I think Trump is frustrated that there is no end in sight to this terrible humanitarian crisis. And I think he has told Netanyahu so. But the problem is that Netanyahu's options are limited by his political allegiances and alliances within the Israeli cabinet. But it's significant that Trump is in the Middle East and yet is refusing to go to Israel.
Interesting. What do we have to look out for? I appreciate that as soon as I edit this and publish it, things that we've discussed may no longer be relevant. But what do we have to look out for, Victor?
So I think in the UK you need to look out for growing unease and discontent in the left wing of the Labour Party, and they're cohering. There are something like 7 left-wing MPs who actually lost the whip of the Labour Party, and they are actually fomenting revolt on the grounds of cutting welfare, cutting foreign aid, and the fact that if you talk to left-wingers, most of them will tell you that Labour leaders campaign and get to power on the basis of a left-wing agenda. But when they get to power, they become Tories. So, and historically, we can reference, the Harold Wilsons and so forth. So, I'm not a member of the Labour family, but that is something to watch out for. The other thing I think is very interesting is how the MAGA Catholics are cohering around J.D. Vance, who is a Catholic convert, and one of their victims thus far has been Elon Musk, who has basically been shouldered out of the administration. And Musk is not to everybody's taste, but in their view, he's not a man of religion, and that is a mark against him. By the way, since Musk toned down his participation in DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, the Tesla share price has shot back up again. So when I last looked, the market cap of Tesla was back to nearly $1 trillion, which is good news for Musk's bank account. I think that there's a lot, which could reveal itself in the months to come. I'm concerned that interest rates are not going to fall as much or as far as the bond markets expect, or the money markets expect, and that government bond yields will continue to rise across the West. And I think we basically will have to face up one of these days that we are in a bit of a fiscal pickle. We're going to have to cut things rather than increase expenditure, and that's going to put more pressure on the likes of Starmer and his Labour allies.
Understood. I like the way that you said agenda. I was thinking, oh, Victor, that's a Freudian slip as she reaches for her tea, or is it tea? Um,
Sorry
Victor,
about getting the dates wrong, by the way. Yeah, I'm always thinking a
don't
month in advance.
listen. Don't worry, because as I said right at the beginning, each day, and you said it's just things are happening so quickly. We don't know whether we're coming or we're going. But thank you for keeping
Right.
us on the straight and narrow for yet another month. And I think next month we'll definitely discuss the lessons that we have to learn from the recent Indian-Pakistan confrontation, because
Oh,
that is a
yes.
destabilizing element that our audience would be very interested in. But they'll have to wait till next month. Victor, it's been a
Okay.
pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Lovely.